So last week, or this week, we're going to continue our study in the book of James. We're in week number 9. We'll be studying James chapter 4, just a few verses this evening, verses 13 through 17, but some very, not as many verses, but a lot of content within these verses. As most things that James writes, he doesn't write a huge book, but everything that he does write is very impactful, very dense, very practical for us. And so this week we're going to be talking a lot about plans. And so is what James will be talking about in just these short verses here. But as each week, we always want to go look at a review, kind of see where we've been, see where we were at last week, to see where we're going, transitioning to this week. So last week, again, we looked at, that's actually the wrong text. It's supposed to be chapter 4, verses 1 through 12. But we looked at this key theme of quarreling, this key theme of pride. And what James did, last week is he gave us some really practical ways in which we can fight pride, fight against us. We looked at the source of quarreling, what were the source of fightings among us, and James hits us square in the nose when he says it's because of us. It's our desires. It's the passions that war within us. And he talks about friendship with the world is being enemies with God, and he talks a lot about pride and how of all the things in the of all the sins in the Bible, pride is one of the things that God lists as something that he hates, and so much so that he opposes it, and what James has said. And so he gives us some practical wisdom, some action items that we can do to help fight against those things. The ones that he listed were resist the devil, draw near to God, cleansing our hands and purifying our hearts, being wretched and mourning, and then humbling ourselves. Before that, we went in detail with some of the things that those meant practically and how that looked in our lives. One of the things that he left off with last week is going to be something that we're going to pick up in next week. This topic of pride and this opposition that God has against pride is not going to be something that that James just dealt with in verses 1 through 12. This will carry forward just a little bit in verses 13 through 17. And so that will be something that we take a look at here this week. So so this week, again, we'll be looking at James 4:13 through 17. Would anybody want to volunteer to read those 4 verses?
Come now, you who say today or tomorrow we shall go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit. Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogance, and all boasting is evil. So whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him such is sin.
Thank you so much for reading that, Brother Jim. I mentioned this in the handout, but we truly live in a very arrogant culture today. We live in a world where it's common for people to boast about all the great things that they do and how much influence over people that they have. I mean, you look at, you don't have to go very far. You look at things like social media and just even by nature, social media, things like Facebook, Instagram, it's filled with people who talk about themselves. I mean, just by nature of social media, there are pages about who? You make a page about who? Yourself, right? I mean, you get a Facebook page. You're not making a Facebook page for somebody else. You're making a Facebook page by ourselves, and certainly nothing wrong with that. But just by nature, it is a focus on the individual, and people can take that and run with it. And what James is going to talk about a little bit here is just this perspective that we have. You know, people go about their days making plans without thinking twice about it, and they go about their lives as if they've got a million years to live. And I talked about at the beginning of this. There's soon to be some themes that we talked about last week. They're going to carry over in this week. We talked about God opposing the proud. One way that James points out that we can demonstrate pride is when we, speak evil against our brethren. Again, we're not just speaking evil of our brother when we do this. We're actually speaking evil against the law, is what James points out. And the reason why that's the case is because if we are speaking evil against the law, or we're speaking evil against somebody else, then that puts ourselves in the position of judge. To put ourselves in this position is to think of ourselves certainly more highly than we ought to. And of course, the antidote of that James points out last week is not to boast, but instead to be humble. And as he points out in verse 13, that humility needs to come across in the way that we plan. So let's look at that first verse in verse 13. It says, "Come now," verse 13 and 14 says, "Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit." He says, "Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes." At first glance, what do you think that when you're talking about verse 13, the person who would say this, at first glance, who do you think that he's addressing? Who would fit that criteria, in other words?
People that are concerned with money, earthly riches.
Mm-hmm. When I think of people like that who are going to do these things, I hone into the word profit. It makes me think of a business, someone who is working, who is wanting to maybe establish a business or grow their business or something along those lines. And so when I thought about this, I thought, well, maybe he's addressing just people in business. But I want you to look at some of the other ways that this impacts. So if you look at the text, he says, today, or at the first part of it, he says, "Come now, you who say today or tomorrow we will go to such and such a place." So first, he's talking to people who make plans to travel, right? So he says, today or tomorrow we will go. So people who are planning to go somewhere are going to a place. Second, if you go on a little bit further, it's impacting those who make plans to arrive at a specific destination. He says, we will arrive at such and such a town, or such and such a town and spend a year there. Third, it impacts those who plan to spend a certain amount of time there. So again, he says, we will spend a year there. Fourth, it impacts those who maybe plan to engage in business. So it says, we will trade. And then finally, it impacts those who expect to have a specific result of their venture. So he says, we will trade and make a profit. Have you fallen in any of those categories before? Someone who plans to travel, to arrive at a destination, to spend a specific amount of time there, to engage in maybe business and to have that business yield something. Do you individually fit into that criteria anywhere? Or have you at some point in your life?
Well, this is just an example. I mean, you don't have to travel to conduct a business. This is in general talking about people that make business plans without considering God. That's the negative part. It's not the planning, it's the problem. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't matter where you go into another town, or you can do it, somebody has a local business. I mean, you got the same situation.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Now I've really got to figure out a way to spend another 45 minutes talking about expounding upon that, because you really just hit the entire thing, the entire point, right there. So we may have to expound upon that about a little bit. Well, let me ask you this. Whenever you read a text like this, is the first thing that comes to your mind when you read somebody who makes a plan like that, And you're right. I mean, absolutely. You hit the nail on the head on this part. Um, do you look at that and say, wow, that is a really arrogant way to think about life? I mean, when you read that statement, is the first thing you think of, man, that person who said that was sinful. They're so arrogant. They're so smug in their plans. I mean, do you initially think that when you read that?
I don't.
I didn't either. In fact, what's funny is like Brittany and I literally had this same conversation a year and a half ago. This was one of the whole reasons why we are here in Northwest Arkansas. This same type of conversation was had in the Ladd household about a year and a half ago, about making plans that were different than what we were expecting. And I guarantee you, when I told my friends and I told the people who are closest to me about this plan, and the idea behind it, no one said to me, "How dare you, Daniel and Ladd family, because you know, how dare you be so prideful in your plans?" Like, we don't think that way. We don't look at things like that. But you know, to your point, that, you know, James is not condemning planning here, but he is condemning planning if what? What's the big criteria that he would be condemning if he's not condemning planning? What's the big if?
Leaving God out.
Yeah, leaving God out.
He's saying we will go.
Mm-hmm.
He goes on to say it's not just planning, but he's boasting.
Mm-hmm.
Like you said, it's an arrogant attitude.
So what do you think is so arrogant about making that plan? About saying we're going to go to such and such today or tomorrow we're going to go to this such and such a town, spend a year there and trade. What is so arrogant about that statement, or just about that mentality and that idea? What's so arrogant about it?
Well, this night your soul might be required of you.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
Daniel, I almost wonder if the translators should not have broken the chapter there, and they should have carried it on to verse 6 of the next chapter, because it connects a whole lot better. Because it's talking about, you know, the rich, the oppressors, basically people that have put a lot of faith in their own wealth and ability to control wealth. And it really seems like it connects to this passage a lot better than maybe the previous passage even.
Chris, that's a great point. You know, he uses, and he's gonna, and maybe the reason why the translators broke it up this way is he uses this statement, "Come now," you know, in verse 13. Then he actually repeats it in chapter 5, verse 1. And maybe they thought he was distinguishing the two, and maybe not. But you're right. I think typically someone who is making this type of statement or has this type of mentality, it's not that far. It's not that far of a stretch to think it's someone who is rich, who is blessed with this world's good. It doesn't mean that it's just exclusive to the rich. It could be for other people. That poor, you know, people who are poor or not, you know, rich with this world's good can just as easily have this mentality as well. But I mean, he's going to address that in chapter 5 too. And I think you're right. These two concepts really go hand in hand about it. And you know, what Danny said is true. The reason why this is such an arrogant attitude and an arrogant perspective is because there are so many things that we do not have control over. There are so many things that we don't know about tomorrow. We don't know what tomorrow is going to bring. You know, but at the same time, while we don't know what tomorrow is going to bring, we can't control what tomorrow will bring. We can't control when it comes. We don't control how long it stays. I mean, yes, we understand that it's 24 hours in a day, but how many of us can say, okay, I want 25 hours in a day, or 24 hours in 1 second, or 24 hours in a minute? We can't control those things. And it's a little presumptuous on our part if we are able to say, if there's something outside of our control, that we can actually say, you know, like we have control over it, even though it's something that's completely outside of our control. And presumption is by nature a symptom of pride. We understand based off what we studied last week on how God feels about pride, don't we? He doesn't like it. In fact, he uses a very strong word, hate. And again, we talked about last week, if God hates something, we should probably run the opposite direction and do everything we can not to exhibit that characteristic. But I think what James is trying to do here is he's trying to shift our perspective with how we look at life, especially on how we make plans. And I want you to consider for a moment the plans that you make. I mean, we do this all the time. I mean, to say that we don't plan, it would be a lie. I think all of us by nature are planners. But think about the concept of planning, because when you plan, I mean, aren't we just essentially putting ourselves in the driver's seat and putting ourselves in control? We plan because we want to control the outcome. We plan our vacations, we plan our budgets, we plan our schedules, we plan our time. Having a plan gives us, or at least gives us, a feeling of some measure of control. Think about the last time you felt out of control. When did you feel out of control? March. Yeah, March. Yeah, that's perfect.
Right now.
Now.
So are you saying that because we can't control tomorrow, we shouldn't make any plans?
No, not at all. Not at all. But what I am saying is
what we expect to happen, but certainly we have to put God in the picture. You can't leave God out of the picture. That's what's wrong here. It's not the planning that's wrong.
Correct. But one of the things that I'm wanting to maybe shift our attention to is when we feel out of control, right? So planning, typically we make plans. It gives us a sense of control. And when I typically feel out of control, it's usually when my plans fail. In fact, nothing is more stressful to me than a failed plan, because typically chaos ensues. And so I'm certainly not saying that planning is, and James is certainly not saying that planning is wrong for us to engage in. I think you're certainly hit the nail on the head when it's the failure to include God in our plans. But I want you to think back in I guess maybe what's interesting to me is when I think about the times in my life that I've leaned into God the most, how many of those times I did so because I felt out of control over something, or something happened that was outside of my ability to handle. And so again, certainly nothing wrong with planning, but I can tell you that the times in my life when I feel like I've leaned into God the most are things that are outside of my control. A sickness of a loved one, or an unexpected death to someone that was close to me. I have no control in those cases as far as my ability to do something with that. James, I think, is pointing out to our lives that no matter how many plans that we make, at the end of the day, our lives are uncertain. Our lives are frail. I mean, think about it. We're a car wreck away from passing from this life. And with the uncertainty and the frailty of this life, I think it should give God's people pause to consider, the plans that we make. The fact that we know that death is coming should impact what we do. Mentioned this in the handout. There's a Reader's Digest study found that 1 out of every 1 person will die in the course of their lifetime. If Reader's Digest said it, it's got to be true. Our life is going to end for us if God doesn't come back first, and that should really change, or excuse me, that should impact the way that we look at our lives. As a society, we don't think about death very often. Death is something, as a culture that we typically shy away from. It's not always been that way. Fun fact for you. back in the Puritans often designed their towns to give a reminder of death and its certainty. In fact, what they would do is many times their cemeteries were in the center of their towns, that no matter what they were doing, what kind of commerce that they did around, during the day, the cemeteries were in the very center of the town to give them pause and give them consideration that this life is going to, is going to come to an end one day. I don't really see cemeteries in the center of town very, very often. So do you guys remember the parable of the rich fool in Luke chapter 12?
Yep.
I won't go take the time to read it, but the rich fool in this parable worked really, really hard to build up a retirement to last him obviously until he died, but little did he know that God required his life a little bit sooner than he expected. He said, "Oh fool, your life is required of you." And someone might look at that and say, "Well, how is that man a fool? I mean, he didn't know that he was going to die that night." Jesus might answer that question by saying yes, but while the man didn't know he was going to die that night, he did know that he was going to die at some point, right? And so the fact that we know death is coming should impact what we do now, and what we do in the future. The perspective kind of reminds me of what the Proverbs writer says in Proverbs 27:1. He says, "Do not boast about tomorrow, for you don't know what the day will bring." And again, we're going to get a little bit further into the perspective that James, calls our attention to, not just to make plans and boast for tomorrow because we have control over tomorrow. It's to make sure that, and we'll get to this in the next verse about our perspective, where it needs to shift from where it is now to where it needs to be. He says, instead of saying tomorrow we'll go to such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make profit, he said, listen to this. This is what we should say. There it goes. So instead, we ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or do that. As it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. So whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin. He says, as it is, you boast in your arrogance. Do you know, have you seen people that exhibit this kind of pride, this kind of arrogance, this kind of boasting?
I think all of us are guilty.
All of us certainly can be.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody who lives today without God in their life is not prepared for tomorrow, that's for sure.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think one of the tendencies that we have, and I think it's really easy to look at a text like this and say, well, yes, this is, the application is we certainly need to include the Lord in our plans to be thinking about that. But what I think is so astounding to me when I look at this is just how few people really do this. How few people really consider the Lord in their plans. Even amongst God's people, how many of us, when we're making plans, consider that, hey, tomorrow may not happen. How many of us say with intention, if the Lord wills. I don't think James is saying before every sentence that we need to do, we need to say, if the Lord wills, we'll meet next Sunday. But you hear people say that quite often, Lord willing, and the creek don't rise. We'll be meeting together next Sunday or next Wednesday or things like that. But it's such a mindset that seems so easy, but it's not, I would say, practiced by very few. I can tell you, when I'm making plans, a lot of times I don't consciously think of what James is talking about here. And I may be an outlier, but I may not be. When I'm making my plans for the year, when I'm making my plans for the day, when I'm making my plans for the week, while I know this is the reality that should be, how many of us actually think about that? And I think that's where James is really hitting us in the face, is that while this seems easy to do, this isn't. And he points out where the error in our thinking is. It's boasting, it's arrogant, it's something that is completely uncharacteristic of what God's people need to be, because that's not something that we typically need to do. He says that to think or do anything else other than this is prideful, arrogant, and evil. Which, I mean, that's a bold claim for such something that seems on the surface such a small infraction. Or such a small thing. I mean, to call something like that is evil. That such boasting, and certainly that it is. I certainly think we get the concept of why it's evil. But it's such a hard thing for us to do, and for us to put into practice. I mean, it's certainly a challenge. I think. And I feel like it would have been a challenge for the people that he is that he is writing to, as well. Any thoughts or comments before we move forward?
I think it can also, I think our thoughts can go back to chapter 1, where he talks about asking for wisdom. We need that every day in our lives, and if we don't have it, if we're doubting, we're being tossed to and fro, and that's kind of the idea you're getting here with the rich young fool and with this individual. Is a life without God is lived in that sort of way.
Mm-hmm.
Just
hey,
kind
Daniel.
of. Go ahead.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, this is Larry. We're all susceptible to this, even those that we read about in the scripture. Katie is in Karen Slatton's class, and they're studying the Exodus and then the wilderness and then entry into Canaan. And there's one account there where Joshua had just defeated Ai finally, and the Gibeonites, who were inhabitants of the land, came and claimed that they weren't inhabitants and they were just passing through. And so they asked the Israelites to protect them and not attack them. And they made an agreement. The problem was they forgot to consult God. You know, they were on a journey. They were on a journey to take over the land of Canaan. And a very crucial thing was, now then they had strangers in the land that were going to affect them forever. So, you know, if we leave God out of our plans or don't think about what the consequences might be, we just make a mistake like Joshua did.
Mm-hmm. That's a perfect. I appreciate you bringing that example up. It reminds me of that passage in, I don't know if it's in Psalms. If the Lord doesn't build the house, they labor in vain who build it. And so you can, if God is not involved in the plans, if God is not involved in the building, and I would say you could probably insert, if God is not involved in your plans, you're laboring in vain with your plans, or your plans are vanity, because you're taking God out of the picture. And I can certainly see how that would be prideful in our thinking about that. Thank you, Larry, for bringing that example up. Are there other examples that you can? Yes, sir, Jeff.
I have a question. So and I don't want to jump ahead. So when we look here at the end, when he says, "So whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin," would you just, and I'm asking everybody, essentially, is he saying we know we should have God in all of our plans, regardless of whether it's doing business or this or that or the other thing? And if we fail to keep God mindful when we make those plans, that's sinful. That is sin. Is that essentially what you draw from that? Anybody?
I wondered if maybe it meant, if you're using, well, sorry, I've got plans, I got to do all these things, and this is what I'm going to be doing, and you fail to take the opportunity to do good, that's where you've messed up, is because you've put your plans in front of God's plans to do good.
Okay. Thank you.
I think I see
Remember
a lot of applications to that. Just making plans to do anything, making those plans without considering kind of what Chris said, without planning to do good, doing God's will. You could apply that to making plans to go on a vacation and not thinking about where you're going to worship when you're not home. I mean, anytime you're making plans and God's not a part of that plan, you're violating what it says, which is the right thing to do and you fail to do it.
I'm just thinking out loud here. Everybody bear with me, okay? Because kind of, like Shelby's getting ready, Lord willing, to go. And I said, Lord willing, but I've been saying that all along to England, but we've already located a church in Newport, Wales, that's about a 20-minute train ride. Haven't been able to kind of find out what their COVID plan is right now, although the entire UK is getting ready to give all their citizenry, I believe, the COVID shot. So, we've tried to make God, okay, here's where you're going to worship when you go. So we've tried not to leave him out of her plans when she goes to overseas to study. But I kind of like the explanation or answer that John and Chris gave about just, we can still make God in our plans, but we can fail still on not doing something right that we should have. We can get so caught up in everything else that we don't do the good that we're supposed to do. Is that kind of what you're saying, Chris and John?
Yeah, that's what I was trying to say. I don't know if it's the right answer, but that's what I was trying to say.
Okay, thank you.
That's when I've been thinking about this and just kind of the comments that are being made, it's there. And that was one of my questions that I was going to ask is how does verse 17 fit in with the rest of what James is talking about when it comes to plan? Certainly there's multiple applications for this outside of planning. But I think we answered the question in what you said about how, knowing to do the right thing and failing to do it for him it is sin. I think this does. I mean, even I'm going to take this a little bit out of context here. Maybe not. I'll let you guys decide. So don't. But I was thinking about this. I feel like this gives us another dynamic of sin that maybe we don't often think about, because, typically when you think of sin, you think of sin as something that you do against God, something that something that's wrong, obviously, that we do. I don't typically think of sin as failure to do the right thing. I usually think of sin as doing the wrong thing. And I think this gives us a different aspect of sin that maybe we're not accustomed to seeing, that really should make us think about what we do, and how we do it, and how we view sin. Again, sin is not just something that God says, don't murder, so we don't murder, or this list of things that we're trying to avoid. There are certain things that we can do, that we can fail to do, I should say, that are the right thing, and even that is considered sin. Now, granted, I think he's, in this particular context, he's talking about plans, but I think that gives us another dynamic of sin that that really should cause us to think more about our relationship and how we sin against God. Does that make sense? Sometimes it makes sense in my head, and then when I start to think it out loud and speak it, it doesn't come out like that. So I just want to make sure that's the case here. He shows us that there are sins that we can commit when we know to do something right but fail to do it, and that to me is almost more scary in some cases, and that sometimes to me is more challenging to identify than it is the do's and the don'ts, or the don'ts, I should say. We think of sin as a prohibition of things that we're not supposed to do, and we've talked about a little bit about that in the letter. Don't say temptation comes from God. Don't be deceived. Don't be a hearer only. Don't show partiality. Don't fight. Don't speak evil. There's a lot of don'ts in there, but I think when we get down to it, James, I think this is really a battle of perspective. It is a battle of how we think about our plans, how we think about how God works in these plans, and how much we want to involve God in our plans. I think James is very clear when he says, why this is boasting, because whenever you take God out of the picture, pride is left, because there are certain things that we cannot control when we make these plans. It's a perspective battle. It's a what is our perspective on our plans and how God works in it? What is our perspective about the future? What is our perspective about how God works in our future? And our perspective about sin. Maybe some questions I'd like to ask as we're kind of transitioning into the application part of this is, when you plan, do you pray about your plans? Do you involve God in your plans and in prayer? Do you read scripture about your plans and see how maybe your plans fit into another narrative that maybe has been seen or encountered in scripture by some other characters in the Bible or some other people in the Bible? Do you ever start your plan by saying, how would God feel about this plan? Sometimes I think about some of the plans that I've made. Usually, sometimes the plans I make a plan, and then sometimes I feel like, oh man, I forgot about God. So how do I rope this into that? And I've been guilty of that. I've almost felt like I've made a plan and made God an afterthought when it comes to my plan. And so, do we make plans with God at the forefront of those? And maybe think about times in your life when you've made plans without God, when you've made plans considering God, and how those things work. How does God's providence work within our plans? That's a good question. And how do we determine that? To me, when I look at this, it is a perspective. It is a perspective of plans. It's also a perspective of how our life is, and even though it's a brief, it is a reminder of our frailty. I think he demonstrates this about when James says that we are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. You think about just a mist and how quickly it comes and it goes, or just like a spritz of perfume that's just there for a little bit and then goes away, and can go away quite easily and quite quickly. I put this in there. I thought this is interesting. This is kind of a very morbid outlook, but I like to share my morbid outlooks with other people too. I put in the handout about a book by Tom Heyman. It says it's called In an Average Lifetime. And what he does is he goes through and he says, he looks at a variety of different things. He says that the average American spends 3 years in a business meeting, 13 years watching television, spends $89,000 on food, consumes 109,000 pounds of food, makes 1,811 trips to McDonald's. I don't know how in the world you factor that. Spends $6,000 or $6,800 in vending machines, eat 35,000 cookies, 1,400 pounds of candy, catches 304 colds, and spends 24 years of their life sleeping. He didn't have this in his book, I don't think. But I just wonder how much time the average American spends in things like prayer and things like Bible study. and things of evangelizing or helping other people or worshiping. And then, you know, as I consider that, how much of my time do I spend doing those things? And as yes, sir.
Just one comment too. Were you through?
No, you go right ahead.
I don't want to interrupt you. I'm sorry.
No.
I'm going to make a comment. I think anyway that in large part, what James is talking to these Christians about is they were having trouble making God sovereign over all things. They wanted to keep certain tasks to themselves. They wanted God to be the boss, for example, over religious issues and moral matters. Just like we want him available on Sundays, then we kind of put him back on the shelf until we need him again. Mm-hmm. And so in this scenario, we handle our own finances. We handle personal relationships. We handle our own family, our business decisions. We handle our recreation. And essentially what we're saying is that God has his realm and we have ours, and we'll call him when we need him. And I think James is trying to reinforce the idea that's not the way it works.
That's a great point. That's a good consideration, because now that as I think about it, and I read this as I was preparing for this, I didn't include it in the handout or my notes here, that the phrase if the God's will was a common phrase in that culture. It wasn't just specific to Christians. In fact, a lot of the Greeks would say that when it came to the plans that they made or the things that they said. So they would say, you know, for example, if the God's will, I'll, make it to the market or something like that, and put it in the context of the polytheistic, worldview that they had. But I just wonder, and I don't know the answer to this. I didn't look this up. I just wonder if the common thought of the day in the Greek society was the gods had their realm and they did their things, just like what Brother Ross was saying. The gods had their realm, they did their thing, and then we have our own realm, we do our thing, and there's no intermingling between the two. There's two separate things. We check our boxes, we give the gods what they want, and then the rest of it's up to us. And I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if anyone else knows quite the answer to that. It makes sense to me, but I don't want to say something without it being, true or validated by someone else. Does anyone else know culturally if that was a thing? You Greek scholars in the audience, Greek historians.
I just know that you can't sequester God, and what God gets concerned about, even in the Old Testament, when he tells us in the Ten Commandments, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me." But that's exactly what he's speaking to here, that you can't be in a position where you're calling your shots and not including me without making yourself God. And when you do that, you've got a problem in your relationship with God. And he's warning us. I mean, listen to what he says. If you're going to play God, here's what you do. Select your own schedule today or tomorrow. Select your own path. We'll go to such and such city. Place your own limits on it and spend a year there. Arrange your own activities. Predict what's going to happen. You're going to make a profit. Do all those things without considering God in the matter in which you've done to set yourself up as God.
That's a great point. I guess going back, it's a perspective issue. How do you perceive yourself, and what is your perspective on life and how God works in it? If we're to be people who are transformed into the image of Christ and into the image of God, if we're to be, living transformed lives, God's going to be a part of that. God can't be a part of our lives without being involved in our plans. That just doesn't work. It just doesn't. Those things go hand in hand. And think about this. I mean, think about the plans that we make. I mean, just as American citizens, the plans that we make. We make plans about our finances. We make plans about our schedules. We make plans about where we go, what we do, how long we spend, a lot of the things that James deals with. When you're making financial decisions and you're planning your future, you're planning your retirement, where is God in those financial plans? Where is the consideration for God in those plans? When you're making vacation plans, where is God in those plans? When we're talking about planning on where we're going to meet, or, if you're going to be gone over a Sunday or a Wednesday, where are you going to go to church? Are you actively looking where you're going to go find a church, or do you wait till you get there to do it? The plans that we, plans that we make, even during our daily lives, how involved is God in those plans? Because if we are to be God's people, those who are the elect, the called out, God has to be at the center of those plans. We can't separate the two, like what Brother Ross had said. What we do in our lives, it matters. How we spend our time matters. How we spend our money matters. What we teach our children matters. What we say and what we do, it all matters. And what we plan, how we plan, and how we include God in those plans, it matters. This life is fleeting. And so it's, I'm reminded of what the psalmist writer says in Psalm 39:4, when he says, show me, Lord, my life's end and the number of my days. He said, let them know how fleeting my life is. You have made my days a mere handbreadth. The span of my years is as nothing before you. Each man's life is but a breath. Man is a mere phantom as he goes to and fro. He bustles about, but only in vain. He heaps up wealth, not knowing who will get it. But now, Lord, what do I look for? Because my hope is in you. Despite all the things that we do, despite all the plans that we make, is our hope and is our perspective, including God, making God the center of those things. Again, it's I feel like it's a tough thing for us as American citizens to look at that, just because our culture is completely different to that. But what is our perspective? Are we separating God and our plans and just saying, God, we'll call on you when we need you. Thanks for the sun. We'll take everything else, take it from here. Or do we involve him in those things and in those plans? This week, as we kind of wrapping things up, first off, is there any questions, comments, concerns, suggestions, complaints over the text? Anything that we want to bring out that has not been mentioned already? Has been very good for a four verse section. I think we had quite a bit of good discussion on the topic. So I appreciate everyone's good comments. But as we kind of wrap things up, continue to read, James, these 4 verses, pray, as we pray for the Lord's will to be accomplished in our plans, and think about the times in your life when you failed to do the right thing. What were some things that you learned? What were some things that you gleaned from that? I think every opportunity that we have is an opportunity for us to grow and for us to learn from our failures, but also from our successes. But I say that failure is a good teacher. But consider these things. Consider what James is telling us about how we plan and our perspective, how we involve God in our plans, and consider those things as we go throughout the week. Next week, we're going to be looking at we'll be transitioning into James chapter 5. Will be James chapter 5, verses 1 through 6. So we'll look at the first 6 verses of James as he's talking about the warning to the rich. And I encourage us to, I know it's really easy, I know for me, whenever I'm reading a text about the rich and say, oh, that's not me because I'm not rich. But consider that, where we are and who we are in this culture, that we are the rich. And so when we're reading this, read it as if James is talking to you, just specifically, because it kind of is. But think about those things and really take to heart what he's going to say in the next chapter when he's talking about come you who say, or come you rich. take special consideration of that, because he's talking to us. He's talking to us as American citizens, because we are rich, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But as just kind of set the tone and set the context. Think about those things as you're reading through that. So, is there anything else that we need to mention, or anyone want to comment before we dismiss?
Daniel?
Yes, ma'am.
I just want to tell everybody that I know what the rich fool died of. He had an eye problem.
That's good. I like that.
The word eye is mentioned 6 times in that narrative.
I see what you did there. I like the pun.
Everybody have a good rest of the week.
Hey, John, would you mind dismissing us in prayer?
Sure. Heavenly Father, we come before you. We're so grateful that you've given us opportunity to take this time to set aside and focus on your word. We're so grateful for brothers like Daniel who can open your word and discern your meanings from it and share it with us, and that we can all share in studying this word together, Father. As we end this class, help us to apply what we've discussed here in our lives, and as we make plans, put you at the beginning of those plans so that the plans can be successful, mostly be successful in spreading your kingdom, Father. Be with us the rest of this week, and we look forward to worshiping you again on Sunday. It's in your Son's name that we pray. Amen.
Amen.